Now, this part of the session, we're going to actually turn into a discussion between the panel members, and at the end of that, we're going to have a question and answer. We're going to save time, almost an hour to do the question and answer. That's very, very important. But to start off with, I'd really like to know, I'll toss this question out. What evidence do we have to ensure that the Common Core is really going to enhance learning? Is there any evidence? Go ahead.
I will address the point because it was just brought up by Dr. Moore, claiming there was no evidence in the development of the standards. You should go and read the report that was done by the creators of the standards, the 50-something page report that shows all the evidence. And that's just in one statement. So I would encourage you to check it out. There's reams of evidence. And that's not even including the evidence that was used to develop each of the state standards prior to the Common Core. It's important to understand that the Common Core was developed based on the best practices of many different states. So the developers of the standards got together and they looked at the best of these state standards across the country. And you might agree, you might disagree on the selections that they take, but overall, we found in our study, I should say, study, that in 3/4 of cases, the standards were better than what was in place before. And that's especially true in Maryland. And I'm not picking on Maryland because back where I come from in Wisconsin, the standards are worse than they were in Maryland. But we looked at Maryland's own standards, and we found that compared to the B+ and A- we gave to the Common Core, these standards for English language arts were rated C. And the math standards were rated an E, which makes them some of the worst in the nation. So I agree with some of the other comments that have been made. Standards are not the only thing that are needed to make sure that we have a quality education system in this state or in this country. But if we're going to have standards, and I think we should, we need to make sure they're as high a quality as possible.
Dr. Wilson, you had seemed to indicate that you had something to say on that as well.
Yeah, sure. The question was whether or not there was evidence of Common Core standards as to whether or not they work. There's as much evidence as there ever was for the state standards, for which there was never any evidence either. So I mean, we're keeping up with this. And the other thing is the connection between standards and accomplishments are, he claims that there's no connection, and there's right, there is no connection. It's an implementation issue. If you write perfect standards and then you ignore them, you're not going to get good results. If you write mediocre standards and then you make sure everybody learns them, you're going to be way ahead. So you wouldn't expect a correlation.
Dr. Tuskowski.
I would just like to add to what these learned gentlemen have said, that there could not be any evidence of the Common Core standards because they haven't been any tests based upon them yet. I mean, we just have to acknowledge the fact that they're just being implemented now in the past 3 years in the schools, and there are no tests yet based on them. So if you're looking for empirical data based on those standards, we simply haven't had the time passed that would allow us to see. There's going to be another problem, and that we won't have any independent points of evidence to even judge whether the standards have improved if we want to be able to trace test scores and have cause and effect between those test scores and the standards, because everything has been aligned downward to Common Core. SATs are in the process of being aligned downward. ACTs have been supposedly aligned downward. GEDs have been aligned downward, and just about everything else has been aligned downward, so that we will not be able to find out from any independent source except right now TIMSS, TIMSS, which is the only one that does not seem to be under the control of the USED for determining whether or not we have dumbed our whole high school curriculum down. We just don't know. But I would like to also address the final piece of what Dr. Wilson said. There is only one state, Massachusetts, that can at least claim indirect evidence for its standards, because the standards that were implemented in Massachusetts in 2001, 2002, and 3 did seem to at least have an indirect relationship to the fact that Massachusetts students went to the top on NAEP test and did extremely well on TIMSS test. That doesn't mean they're the only factor, and that's part of the problem they'll always have. There are teacher tests, there are what kind of teachers you have in your schools. There are other factors involved in evaluating a set of standards. And we will never really know exactly what weight each of these other factors have in the equation. When I am asked what accounts for the so-called Massachusetts miracle, the standards are only one piece of it, but certainly the teacher component, the strengthening of our teacher corps, had to have played a role. To what extent it played a role, we can never know. All of this involves too many variables, and there's no way to isolate any of them for a clear factor analysis of cause and effect. So we
With
just
that-
don't have anything.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I wondered if you could tell me the 50-page document that you were mentioning, Mr. Brickman. Do you know who did that study?
No, I do.
Who?
I think, are you mentioning benchmarking for success report? I think that's, the benchmarking for success report is the only report cited on the Common Core website. I've actually read that report. I wrote about it. It has over 135 endnotes of citations. Only 4 of those would be considered relevant to national standards. Where the Common Core makers get most of their support, their empirical support, is from this study done by Eric Himshek called The Role of Cognitive Skills. And I've reviewed that study, and other academics have as well. And it's flawed because it treats all the countries around the world like they're apples to apples. And we can't do that. So the evidence that the Common Core puts on its website to claim that they are, in fact, evidence-based, lacks evidence.
Well, let's make sure that we're talking about the same report. Is that the same report we're talking about?
Yeah, I don't think it is, so I'm not sure which one you're looking at, but.
No, it's the only one on the actual website of the Common Core.
Yeah, it's been around for a while.
Yeah, but I think there's different reports if you actually look in the standards. You can find it, and we'll,
Sure, no, I'd love to.
But if I could just respond to some of the other points.
One second.
Well, I just
Dr.
wanted
Jones.
I wanted to finish that. The reason for my question was I noticed that a lot of the proponents, the corporations, nonprofits that support the Common Core, majority of their studies come from a global consulting firm called McKinsey & Company. And McKinsey & Company has a lot of input into doing studies about the state of public education and where we're lagging and where we're succeeding. And it's very interesting that if you look back at this thing, one of the things that I noted was McKinsey & Company have, if you just Google the word big data, and that's what they call big data, they're the gurus of big data in any industry, including public education. And from McKinsey, 3 of the lead organizers for the Common Core state standards, Luke Gerstner, who's the co-founder of Achieve, David Coleman, who's now at College Board and was one of the architects for Common Core, and Sir Michael Barber, who's now the CEO of Pearson Publishing Company, all came from McKinsey & Company. So the company that is producing a lot of these studies that say that we need these things have also funneled out to us 3 of their main delivery boys to provide for us the things that they claim that we need to have in the first place. So I'm always questioning when you say study, who did the study, who paid for it, who's profiting?
Well, let's go back to the question, though. The question is, what evidence do we have that ensures that the Common Core will enhance learning? That's the question.
But there's no guarantee of anything. I think it's a good point from Dr. Wilson that if you have really good standards and you don't implement them properly, you don't assess them properly, you're not going to see good results. I agree with Dr. Stoutsky. Well, I agree with Dr. Stoutsky that, I'm glad she mentioned teacher prep. I was fortunate to be able to work with Dr. Stoutsky on improving teacher prep in the state of Wisconsin. And I know she's done good work on that in Massachusetts and other states. This is but one piece of the puzzle. And to say that there's no evidence in the development of the standards, and that's just factually untrue. But to say that standards don't lead to higher results, I guess my question would be, would you rather have high standards or would you rather have low standards? And if you look at the states that have had high standards, but yes, also as Stephen pointed out, you need to be doing the other things right too. You are going to see results.
Well, what are those states that you consider high standards? I've heard that mentioned a couple of times. What states have high standards that you could use as your standard bearer?
I would offer, because they were generally recognized as having high standards before Common Core. California, Indiana, Massachusetts, and maybe a few other states. But they were all acknowledged to have generally high sets of academic standards. Didn't mean that their students all did very well. They all simply had standards that were acknowledged by experts in the field as being high, rigorous, having the content that was necessary.
And
That's all.
the big difference between California and, say, Massachusetts is that Massachusetts also did some of the things you were talking about in teacher prep, also had a really high quality assessment. California, on the other hand, they did have good standards, but their assessment would set the bar. It's offensive how low they set the bar. That's how low many states set the bar. Because essentially what you do when you're setting the bar low is you're reminding parents, you're reminding about how students are actually.
Well, I want to jump in on all this conversation about standards because something that we haven't really talked about, and it may not be particular to this particular school community, but in regards to the overall conversation, the giant pink elephant in the room that we haven't talked about that Chris mentioned is poverty. Poverty is one of the number one determining factors of your success on a standardized test and how well you're going to do in a classroom. Since I've been around 25 years, we have known that class size matters, that resource matters, that good teachers matter. Whether or not these came down on tablets from above, or whether or not they're really lousy, is going to be irrelevant when you don't address the other factors that go into influencing a child's success in school, whether it's nutrition and wraparound services, all these other factors. Children don't just miraculously drop everything else that they're struggling with at the door because you handed them gold-plated standards or not. Not to mention the fact that when we deliver these standards and the PARCC assessments that are going to go along with them, we're going to be spending millions, if not billions of dollars more than we already do for the infrastructure to deliver everything online. We have these nonprofit companies, nonprofit organizations like Hope Street and other organizations that will now get paid to deliver for you and manage the Common Core standards and the testing for you, because it's also complicated that we're going to need help. So we're going to be funneling more and more money that should be going for librarians and school lunches and recess and art teachers and music programs. Are now going to be going to making sure that our computers are updated for the most recent version of whatever we're going to need to deliver the tests and to pay the data miners who are going to be keeping the data company, and for companies like Achieve and these other nonprofits that are going to come in and deliver for you what used to be delivered by the state, and local government and local school communities. So not only do we ignore poverty, which is an insult to the children that Common Core claims to be providing equity for them, it's a slap in the face to those struggling communities and those children. It's going to funnel even more money out of those schools and funnel more money out of schools like ours that should be going towards things that we have known for decades, if not, centuries, I'm exaggerating, for decades at least, do in fact make for meaningful classroom learning, and it doesn't involve a better test. It never has, and it never will.
I am in favor of the statement that we do not want just a bigger and better test as the solution to our problems. But I think we need to be careful about saying that poverty is the major problem when the problem in this country for 50 years has been a decline in what we expect of our public school system. And that what we were able to show in Massachusetts was that all students can achieve better under the present system. Standards were not dealing with poverty. They were not dealing with family conditions. They were dealing with what teachers could teach to in their classrooms. And yes, we can improve that situation. The test is the secondary thing. Some people might think that the test drove the standards or the classroom curriculum, but it didn't in Massachusetts. There was a curriculum that teachers were choosing and putting in place, and it varied from place to place. But poverty is not the only problem that we face in this country, and it would be folly to say that all we need to do is increase the amount of money for poor children and we're going to be fine. Our top 70% are not doing as well as they should. All children need to do better in this country. We have an underperforming set of school children in this country. As a country, it's not just the bottom 30%, it's the whole 100% practically.
Dr. Wilson?
Yeah, well, this is, although it's important, first I want to get back to content and testing, but in reality, it's embarrassing to live in a country with so much poverty. There's no excuse for it. We're a wealthy country. We should. But I want to get back to math. And we already have testing. And if you don't like testing, it doesn't matter, because we have over 80% of high school graduates in this country go on to college. And the first thing that happens to them when they get to college is they take a placement test. And as a result of that placement test, over 70% of the mathematics taught in colleges in the United States today are K through 12 mathematics. So not only are people mathematicians, 13th grade teachers, but we're teaching K through 12 math. So I would like to see real tests that are not grade inflated. And if you give a real test in K through 12, you're going to find that maybe 25% of the students actually know what they're doing. 25% are absolutely clueless, and there's 50% that have a vague idea. And if people were told that, they wouldn't have to wait until they showed up the first week in college to get told that they don't know anything. And that would be really helpful if they knew it before they went to college. Now, we did a study a couple of years ago, and the previous superintendent wrote an op-ed article and stated outright that they would never pay any attention in Maryland to that placement test that is given to every single entering freshman in the community college in the state of Maryland. So I have my problems. On the other hand, if you give a test that gives real grades, there will, like Park, which is Maryland is a Park state, if people get real grades out of this test, there is going to be such a ferocious backlash from parents and politicians that it'll only happen once. So, and that's too bad, because I think that if they would keep doing it, then people would respond and say, look, we're not actually getting our job done. When they go off to college and they take that remedial math or high school algebra 2 over again for credit, high schools don't learn about that. When you graduate from high school, you fall off the face of the earth. And K through 12 is a closed system. You don't have to worry about that. As you can see, I'm not an optimist. And this is with or without Common Core. Keep Common Core, do the best you can with it. I'm not optimistic. Get rid of it. I'm really not optimistic.
Mr. Burke?
Yeah, and I do agree with many of your points, and glad that we're getting things back to the standards in place. But it's important to realize, first of all, in this discussion of poverty, that poverty is not present. That students in poverty can succeed, can learn. And if we want to ensure that happens, then we need to make sure we have a strong system of accountability. We need to have a strong set of standards. Let's make one thing clear. Whether you're talking about a Common Core or you're talking about any set of standards, that's the floor. It's not the ceiling. Many students have and will continue to exceed those expectations. But when you set the bar extremely low, the students in poverty, the students who haven't traditionally been succeeding in our education system, those are the ones who are going to be disproportionately affected. Because those are the students who get brushed under the rug. We say, look, they're proficient. Proficiency doesn't mean you're anywhere near getting ready to go to college or to go into a career in the military or have a productive job where you can support yourself. But they're proficient, and so year after year, decades, states have said, we're okay because we're proficient. And to Dr. Wilson's point, when you raise the bar higher, it's tough politically. You're getting closer to the truth. I think we could raise the bar even higher if Maryland wants to do that. I say good for them. But getting closer to the truth is what we're about. And if you're going to continue to dumb down standards, Maryland does in fact revert back to the old set of standards, the old set of tests, we're going to continue to get a place where we're not being honest about how students are actually.
You know, we keep talking about standards, changing standards, adapting standards. My next question to the group, to the panel is, what is the ability, who has the ability to change or adapt our standards? Superintendents, is the Board of Education, is the parent? Who is it? Academians? Who is it? Dr. Stasi?
We don't know who is going to be able to change standards because Common Core was copyrighted by a group of organizations that no longer exist as a group. So there is no mechanism in place for revising these mediocre standards. This is a major problem that no Board of Education bothered to ask about. We have, we're in limbo. We have 46 states that have adopted sets of standards, all of which need to be revised thoroughly. And there's no way to revise them unless they do it on a state-by-state basis, which they could be doing as if they were state standards. And this is something we need to hear from teachers about. Every state should be surveying its teachers and asking them what corrections, revisions, additions, deletions they should be making to the standards they are operating under, which happen to be Common Cores in 46 states. And then each state should go about improving whatever they have. We don't need to be frozen in one set of mediocre, damaging standards. And that's the problem we face. We don't know how to revise them.
Well, that's just not accurate, and I think
Who
you
could
look,
revise them?
well, states, it's not even a hypothetical, states have to revise.
Who could revise Common Core?
It doesn't matter if these are state standards. What matters to the people in this room, matters to the state of Maryland, is what set of standards are the students in Maryland going to be learning. And if you want to call it Common Core, if you want to call it the Maryland standards, the name doesn't matter. I'm not so concerned with the name. What matters is what is the set of standards actually in place. And we've seen numerous states that have taken Common Core and said, we can do better. We want to make these more uniquely our own. And if Maryland does that, as long as they're moving in the right direction, moving towards more rigor and more clarity for educators, that's something that I would support. Massachusetts did exactly that. They
They
took
could only add
Let
15%
me pass it
by
on.
law.
I can take it.
Where do you want me to go with this?
Tell me, how do we change it?
I think both Michael and Dr. Salsky are correct in some ways. If your state filed a race to the top waiver, I'm sorry, if your state filed a race to the top grant or an NCLB waiver, I would recommend that you read those. But most of them state very clearly, you have to adopt college and career-ready standards. Really, the only ones that the Department of Education is approving, of course, is Common Core. So what happens then is at the state bureaucratic level, okay, they monitor the curricula at the local schools or the county school districts. So the state bureaucrats that are in charge of monitoring come in and they look at your curriculum and they determine if you are in fact aligned to the Common Core. Now, could you add things? Yes. Are you allowed to delete portions of the Common Core from your local standards? No, not in states with Race to the Top or NCLB waiver. So in that case, possibly it's an implementation issue, but it's still the fact. We cannot eliminate Common Core standards in New Jersey. We can't eliminate them in New York. They're both Race to the Top and both NCLB waiver states. So I think it depends on the state, but the devil's in the details, and we need to read more about the devil.
I would jump in on that also, I think, in conjecture here, that state is conjecture. That what's going to matter is less about what's going to be in the standards and what's going to be on the tests. Because the modus operandi of having a nationalized curriculum, state-led, whatever that means, is to have a consistent set of apples to apples to apples around the state so that you can have consistent state tests. So every state around the country who has the Race to the Top money, Common Core is looking at the SBAC and we're PARC. One of the reasons we might be PARC to consider is the fact that our state superintendent, Lillian Lowry, is on the governing board for PARC. We've also become its fiscal agent, which means that we manage the money for PARC because they can't do it because they're a nonprofit. So we're going to handle their money for them. And What's going to matter with PARC is because the new teacher evaluations had to come along with Race to the Top. So the way we evaluate our teachers now is going to be dependent on how well those children do on the test. See, regardless if they're English language learners, if they have special needs, if they have attendance problems, health problems, learning, it doesn't matter. The teacher's going to be evaluated on how well those children do on those PARC tests. The other thing important about the PARC is it's going to increase the number of testing days exponentially. Because if everything is evaluated on the Common Core standards, in New Jersey, they claimed that approximately 44 formative and summative tests a year, and approximately 215 tests by the time the child has gone from kindergarten to grade 12. That's a lot of money that could pay for a lot of librarians and art teachers and music instruction going to pay testing companies that have partnered with Common Core to make sure that they happen.
Mr. Burton?
Sure, so a lot of things that I could respond to, and I don't have time to go into detail on all of them, but you said that it's going to mean exponentially more testing, not adding. We've looked at, we actually just did an event on testing. Turns out most tests are actually administered locally, not by the states, and certainly not by the federal government. You said it's a national curriculum. That's just factually inaccurate. The Common Core standards is important, where there are a set of standards. There are a set of goals and expectations. They're not a curriculum. They're not lessons. They're not things that are devised locally. As always, keep in mind, Maryland had standards before. Every state had standards before. They just, 3/4 of cases, were not as good as the Common Core. Now, when it comes to modifying standards, again, states have modified standards. You can look at Florida, you can look at Alabama, you can look at New York is looking at doing, Wisconsin's looking at doing, Indiana's looking at doing. There are state after state is doing this. You talked about waivers. Texas got a waiver. They did not adopt the Common Core. So to say, as Richard you said before, it is a fact that you have to adopt the Common Core according to the federal government. It's not a fact. It's clear as day that it's not a fact because there are states that you can point to where the things, the doomsday scenarios that are being described are just not taking place. Finally, these tests, we talked about it a few minutes ago, about is this being piloted? Is this something that we're looking at to see if it works? And I agree, it will come down in many cases to the tests. Well, the tests are being done right now, this year.
All right,
They're being piloted in
Dr.
states.
Wilson, you-
Sure. The actual Common Core standards are written in stone. You can play around on the edges if you want, but one of the reasons they're written in stone is because the majority of states, if they had their way, they would chip away at that stone and make it much worse. Now, Common Core standards are not perfect. I can criticize them all day long, but if the states had their way, in particular, if Maryland had its way, they would make them much worse. So that's one reason for to keep them in stone, at least for a few years, and see what happens. Another thing that people talk about was the mention of a national curriculum. Actually, there is no curriculum at this stage. The curriculum is distinct from the standards. Think of a curriculum as your textbook or what you're actually doing to use in the classroom. And only one state is actually developing a curriculum. And as a consequence, they're getting backlash earlier than everybody else. But everybody else is passing the buck down to the local people. It's got to be local. You have to decide what you're going to teach in the standards or how you're going to teach them, what textbooks you're going to use, because nobody's out there trying to help right now.
Dr. Stoss.
I would, first of all, like to say that Professor Wilson's comment that Common Core was set in stone is something you should remember. Even those states that are now pretending to tailor Common Core standards to their state, they're changing the name. I was in Florida listening to them, changing the name to the Sunshine Standards.
They also made 80 or 90 modifications.
I saw what they made. They added 52 calculus standards, which mean nothing because there's no way to get to those calculus standards from the weak algebra 2 core standards that they have. So they made a pass. at pretending to add something that would modify the document. It is still basically Common Core completely. Alaska calls its standards the Alaska Academic Standards. It was cut and paste from Common Core. They just reduced the introduction. I looked at Pennsylvania's academic standards, which they said were tailored to Pennsylvania. All they did was cut out the examples in parentheses for Common Core standards, but they haven't changed the stem. You look to see what tricks the different states are playing when they say they are making the standards tailored to their own state. They're not. And it makes sense that they wouldn't, because Common Core means Common Core. You're going to have a test based on those Common Core standards. You've got to have them all the same. Otherwise, the test would be illegally applied to a state that didn't have the standards that it should be applied to. So no state is changing the core of Common Core's standards, even though they may be changing the title. We've been hearing that a lot. There are states that want, Huckabee supposedly, Governor Huckabee has said, change the titles, become toxic, but keep the content. Well, that isn't going to address the problem. The problem is that there are serious deficiencies in both English and math, and there is no mechanism for getting at those deficiencies. That is the state we are in right now.
This time, before I do, I need to unhinge Mr. Griffin before he comes to conclusion.
No, I think you look at, I just disagree with that. You look at the states and make modifications. And all of them are, there are states that are making substantive changes. To a point, they're going to look similar. Many state standards are going to look similar. Massachusetts whole standards are quite similar to Massachusetts standards. The Common Core, you're going to require in any reasonable set of standards that students know their multiplication tables, they know how to read a text and make deductions from it. These are things that I think are going to be in standards regardless. That's why a state appointed group of educators and leaders in Massachusetts looked at the Common Core and they looked at Massachusetts standards and they found they were extremely similar. Our review found the standards were extremely similar, and yet, to Massachusetts credit, they decided that the Common Core was slightly an improvement over what was in place before, and they chose to go with the Common Core.
Could I respond to that?
Yes.
Quickly.
The Gates Foundation paid for all of those reviews. I was on the Board of Education at the time. Every one of them. A chief was paid by Gates Foundation to come out with a review of crosswalk, I'm sorry. That wasn't cakewalk. Between Massachusetts and Common Core. And it said it was 6 of one, half a dozen the other. Then Gates gave $250,000 to Huntington, North Carolina, which came as a pass-through to the Massachusetts Business Alliance of Education, which asked the WestEd assessment group in California also to do a crosswalk. And they found that basically they were about the same. Maybe Common Core was better. And then Fordham, which also received Gates Foundation money, found that indeed Common Core had earned a B+ in English, and the Massachusetts standards were A-, but too close to tell. So therefore, they were all about the same, no real difference. Ask the teachers today in Massachusetts.
Okay.
And they
Well,
Let me go-
I know we want to look at other people a chance, but we're talking about funding to our
30
organization,
seconds.
and supposedly, the obvious implication is, well, nobody could possibly believe in the Common Core or its standards unless they received money to do so, right? That's the idea, is any group that said something nice about the Common Core, like they got Gates funding, or
They did.
would be part of.
All right.
So hold on 1 second. They didn't, that's not accurate. If you look at the associations, the groups of educators that have endorsed this, pretty much every mathematical organization in the country.
Which one?
Here's 15. I challenge Dr. Stotsky to tell me which of those.
No, the reason I asked you
organizations-
which one was I wanted you to to read a couple on there.
Sure.
Because not everybody in here has a list, right?
So the American Mathematical Association, the American Mathematical Society, the American Statistical Association, the Association for Women in Mathematics, the Association of Mathematics Teacher Educators, the Association of State Supervisors of Mathematics. On and on and on. That's the math standards, there's just some more of those regular standards as well. But the important point is this. To say that the only reason these groups are saying nice things is because they were brought up is really unfair.
Yeah.
Okay, hold on a second.
I didn't
Hold on,
say
hold
that. I did not
on,
say that.
hold on. I'm still the moderator, okay?
I didn't say that.
All right.
You would have to quote me after.
Hold on. Please.
All right. I'm a parent. You all been grocery shopping, right? When you come across a box of Fruit Loops, okay, it says on the front, made with whole grain, in a little squiggly thing. It says part of a nutritious breakfast. Now, how many of you pick that box up and go, well, dang, I'm gonna throw that in my cart and give my kid a nutritious breakfast? No. What do? We turn the side over and we read the ingredients. The way I understand Common Core is when you look at the shiny packaging, the billions of dollars that go to pay the people to support it, the corporations, the studies, the nonprofits that do, they give you a shiny cover that says career and college ready. They give you something that says internationally benchmarked, state approved. Turn it over and read the ingredients carefully. And the reason I gave you this is because I want you to read the ingredients very carefully and truly understand what this is and what it is not. And that's what I'm closing.
Sure, well, although you heard some disagreements tonight, I think the one thing you really is a group of people who care about kids. And I think that's the most important thing to take away from this. But the debate that we're engaging in here, I believe, should have occurred in every community in the United States.
Amen.
Because I think what it comes down to is the Common Core might be very good for some communities. And they should have the choice to use it, but they should make that choice. Whereas other communities, they may have already been doing things that are very successful for their kids, and they should have that choice as well. I just think it comes down to we're a local control country. We should have input into what we think is best for our kids, not some distal bureaucrat far away from where my kid sits every day. Thank you.
Since the Fordham Foundation evaluation of state standards has been criticized because it was funded by Gates, since I'm the guy who wrote it, I would like to say a few things. Number one, had they told me it was funded by Gates, I would have asked for more money. I only found out that it was funded by Gates a year later when people started calling me a Gates lackey. The other thing is that all I care about is the content. And that's what I look at. I never had any pressure from Fordham in any way about the grading of the states. And because there are 50 states and there are some really, really atrocious standards out there, the difference between an A state, of which there were a handful, and the A- for Common Core is really significant. The fact that A- is ahead of a good 40 plus states and significantly ahead of them is really nice. But what is really, really sad is that those 5 states with much better standards gave them up, and they should have.
Right. Okay, folks, we're going to get the last two comments, but what I want to do is while they're answering, while they're providing their answer, and this is their last opportunity to answer, I would like those who would like to ask questions to use this mic and this mic come forward. And when, again, I'm going to, please come forward if you want to ask questions. But while you're doing that, I would like the last two, Dr. Stowski and Mr. Brickman, to have their final salvo. So if you want to ask questions, please. Go ahead.
I'm just going to say very quickly, because I'm always asked, how did Massachusetts give up such good standards? The answer is very simple. $250 million of Race to the Top money was promised. President Obama is a friend of Governor Deval Patrick, and we all knew that we were going to get $250 million if the Board of Education voted to dump its own standards in English and math and adopt Common Core's. And that is exactly what the commissioner recommended. And then we had these three so-called independent evaluations, all urging us to do the same. In addition to which we had a Department of Education appointed review committee from the field, which also said Common Core was so vastly superior to what we had that how could we pass up such a good art?
Mr. Burke?
Well, I
You got the last word.
well, we have questions.
Judge.
I certainly agree that there's an opportunity to strengthen Common Core, even above where it is today. Absolutely, many stations will be. And I hope that they will. Just one final point, because I didn't finish my point before on why we said Maryland standards were weak, because this is an important point. Maryland had standards that were weaker before. We said that, through different evaluations that we did, we said in English language arts they're rated a C. Well, Dr. Stowski did a report, work order, also looking at standards in 2005, and she also gave Maryland a C. So, I think it's important to understand that there is wide agreement in where standards will be good. I think there's agreement that we could probably do even better, and should do even better. And I hope that's where the focus will be. Is Maryland going to have the Common Core, which is a higher set of standards than what it had before? Or is it going to go even higher? Or is it going to revert back? I really hope the emphasis will be on progress and make the standards as good as possible while focusing on the other things.
Thank you very much.